Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Two Way. This is a program we call Two Way Tonight. It's on Two Way and it occurs tonight here in the East. Out West, we could call it Two Way this afternoon. Tokyo, we call it the morning meeting. A lot of options, but we choose to call it Two Way tonight. Thank you for being part of Two Way. If you're here on the Two Way platform and want to be in on the conversation as we talk about both the news of the day and the topic of crypto, currency, and the new economy, please raise your hand. If you're watching on X or YouTube, don't raise your hand, but do not put smack in the chat. We have two great guests with us here tonight. This is sometimes the case. One returning guest, Lyndsay Keith, great journalist, and a new guest who we're very excited to have on, Kaivan Shroff, who's a Democratic strategist. Both of them, if you ask them, if you were sitting next to them on an airplane and you said, so what do you do? Both of them would say, I live a life of peace, love, and understanding. At least that's what I assume they'd say. So we're glad to have them both here. And then a little later in the program, Paul Grewal, General Counsel of Coinbase, will be here to speak simultaneously to those of you who know exactly what Coinbase does and those of you who have no idea. Paul has that magic capacity to do what we like to do here, which is speak in both a sophisticated and accessible manner. So watch the magic happen. Lots going on in the new economy currently, and cryptocurrency was the subject of a hearing today in the Senate. And next week in the House of Representatives, it's Crypto Week. Crypto Week. The founders never foresaw Crypto Week, and yet the Republic will continue along, even though they're doing that. We'll talk all about the state of that industry with Paul a little later in the program. In just a moment, I'll bring in the guests, and after I run through some headlines, and then again, we'll be eager to hear your questions. It's one of those days where there's no clear lead. I'm looking at a list of items to talk through with you, and it's a mixed bag. The president talked a little bit today at the White House, not as much as yesterday. There was no 2-hour roving press conference, but he did talk today, talked about immigration, talked about Harvard, and he talked about Mr. Comey and Mr. Brennan, who are now apparently being investigated by the Justice Department, former head of the FBI, former head of national intelligence. The president suggested today they were crooked as hell. And Mr. Brennan, who is a paid consultant to MSNBC, responded. We'll listen to that. One thing we'll look a little bit at is Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, who is extremely powerful and influential and rarely does any interviews of any sort. Sat down for a video interview with Miranda Devine for her video podcast. And so we'll look at some of that and you'll get to hear her talk. Joe Biden's doctor, Kevin O'Connor, was on Capitol Hill today and refused to testify in front of Mr. Comer, not Mr. Comey, Mr. Comer's committee, investigating the questions of Joe Biden's acuity and whether his loss of acuity impacted his ability to do his job. In this case, he asserted both doctor-patient confidentiality and his Fifth Amendment rights in refusing to answer the first two questions. And with that, he left. And we're going to talk about that. And we don't like to talk about things as media stories all the time, but fascinating, as I predicted this morning, the minute it happened, it's not getting very much coverage. And I think if this were a Republican doctor for a Republican president and the same set of facts, it would be getting a lot of coverage. So we'll see what our guests think about that. It's not the biggest story in the world, but it is an interesting window into what's going on. So again, just a moment, bring in our guests. We'll run through some of these videos and some of these stories. And then a little later, Paul will be here to talk about all that's going on with cryptocurrency. But now a word from our sponsors, Cozy Earth. Cozy Earth, perfect for this time of year. It's summertime. And while the living is easy for many, it's also very hot. It's hot where I am. I don't know how hot it is where you are, but their stuff is the best for hot weather. It's all made from viscose from bamboo, naturally wicks away heat and moisture from your body, helping you sleep several degrees cooler. Their bamboo sheets come, as you probably know, with a 100-night sleep trial. You can try them out. If you like them, you can keep them, of course. If you don't, you can return them hassle-free. If you do keep them, they come with the 10-year warranty. That's all their bedding products have. It is a great way to sleep cooler. I'm enjoying the sheets. And as I've told you before, I'm having a kind of a love affair with the pants. They're the most comfortable pants I own, and they are so cool when it's hot. I recommend it all to you. You can upgrade your summer sleep. If you want, head to CozyEarth.com. Use the code TWOWAY That gets you 40% off best-selling sheets, pajamas, and more. It also shows your love and affection for the Two-Way platform, because if you use the code Two-Way, the company knows it and they say, well, what a great sponsorship we have with Two-Way. So please, right now, go to cozyearth.com, use the code Two-Way, sleep cooler, lounge lighter, stay cozy. All right, let's bring in our guests. Somebody will bring them in while I tell you about them. Lyndsay Keith is one of the best reporters I know, independent journalist. She covers the White House. She covers politics. She used to host a program with Sean Spicer, my friend Sean Spicer, and she's very talented, both reporter and analyst. So Lyndsay Keith is here. Somebody's bringing her in, I hope, because I'm at a loss to how to do that currently. And then joining us for the first time, Democratic strategist Kaivan Shroff, who also very happy. Hi, Lyndsay. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you so much.
Kaivan Shroff is a Democratic strategist. Lyndsay, do you know Kaivan?
I don't. Kaivan, it's great to be on with you.
Well, here he is. Somebody's going to bring him in, and there he is. Kaivan, welcome. Well, nice to meet. Kaivan, I know Lyndsay watches Two-Way sometimes. Are you a fan of the platform?
Always.
I am, and I appreciate that you said we usually will be having a heated conversation, but there's great to have space for these types of conversations too.
Awesome. Tell people a little bit about your career. Lyndsay used to work in Republican politics, and you work in Democratic politics. Tell people like what politicians or organizations have you worked with?
Yeah, so I'm currently a senior advisor at the Institute for Education, a 30-year-old bipartisan nonprofit in DC. I also do different political consulting. I worked on the digital team for Hillary for America, went really well. And I was a delegate for Vice President Harris in 2024 and continue to work with different Democratic candidates locally. So excited to join.
Okay, and where would you put yourself on the spectrum of the Democratic Party?
I'd say center left. You know, I definitely am concerned to see some of the charges to the far left, and also think that we could see more of the center speak up for some of the things that they might have at a different time. So that's kind of
you live in the Washington, D.C. area?
No, I'm actually in New York City. So
New York City. All right. Well, what do you think of your party's nominee for mayor?
I didn't rank him. You know, I'm open to being convinced. At the same time, I think that he's making a big mistake, as is his, base of trying to make this into a national referendum on where the Democratic Party should go. I think they're much more suited to make the argument that politics should be local, and that if a candidate like him can win, it is in a city like New York City. But I think I'm even seeing, a lot on the left already start to turn on him as he goes into more politician mode and sort of gets away from those purity politics that so many leftist candidates come from, where now he's not anti-Israel enough, I'm seeing from people. He said he would compromise on some different policy proposals. If he can even get a compromise, I'll be impressed. But, that base doesn't like to hear that type of language. So I think it's sort of a very complicated moment for the Democratic Party on the one hand. And on the other hand, I do think national Democrats should not make the mistake of falling into this trap where Republicans sort of target an outlandish example or voice, perhaps, and then force this test of, do you endorse everything he's ever said on a podcast and tweeted, or do you hate him and, we have to abandon all these minorities type thing? It really is, not that complicated to say, stop the racism, stop attacking him for his background. Let's talk about policy.
So you're saying it's a mistake for Republicans to try to make him the face of the Democratic Party?
No. I think it's a mistake for Democrats to take the bait on that, which I see a lot of them doing.
Got it. Well, let me ask you both about the current state of the Democratic Party, because I'm interested in what you both have to say about it. I saw some data today about the trajectory of the popularity and unpopularity of the Democratic Party. It's kind of incredible how unpopular the Democratic Party is right now. I'm not sure it's the most unpopular either party has been in the modern era, but it's pretty close. Lyndsay, why would you say the Democratic Party right now is so unpopular?
I think looking at the last election, which would be the biggest, measuring litmus test for us, is ultimately that the party has swung too far left, and the identity of the party has really, dissipated. When I think about, so many moderate Democrats who would even say, someone like a Joe Manchin, who I believe, this is a loose quote, but has said, if you talk to a lot of West Virginians who say they're Democrats, they'd say they no longer identify with a Democrat who represents them in DC. They say they haven't changed. It's actually the Democratic Party who has changed. And, I was on the campaign trail this last cycle at Kamala Harris rallies and at Trump rallies. It's really fascinating to talk to so many voters at Harris rallies who would actually confide in me about things they liked about Trump. And they would say, I can't vote for him because he's Trump. But there were certain things that he liked. And, obviously, MAGA is really a departure actually from Republicanism as well. I would say it's a different party in and of itself from, I would say, Reaganism or even a Romney type Republican. But I thought it was really fascinating because things like transgenderism, if you thought about forever wars, some of the things that MAGA represents, even immigration was really an issue that many people wished that Harris was more strict and firm on her immigration stance and being bolder. And if you looked at polling as well, it showed 80% of Americans believed, and this was post-election, that people who are here illegally should be deported, who were here in the last 4 years. So I think that the party just went too far left and lost touch with what voters were actually telling them and saying. And it's been, the last thing I'll say on this, it's been very interesting to see how the party has responded. And really, they've lost, I would say Biden helped them lose credibility because so many people stood behind him and said he was fine, when clearly he wasn't. And then the transition to Kamala, many people were very frustrated with that. There was no primary process. There were no town halls for her, that they just adopted this person who was polling very low to replace Biden. And so I think they just made some, they took some gambles that have really put them behind astronomically. And there has been no face that has emerged as the leader yet. And that is detrimental. And they are also taking the same lines as they did in 2016 against Trump, Orange Man bad, opposed to talking about their dynamics and what they're doing for the American people. It's all about Trump. I think they haven't learned that lesson. At least that's been my perspective so far about how to really handle Trump.
Right. Kaivan, I'd love you to critique what Lyndsay said and what you agree with, what you didn't agree with, because that's a pretty comprehensive, I think, view of the policy, political, personality challenges.
Yeah, look, I think the game of politics is you get right over that 50% and all the narratives tend to go your way. So I do think some of those critiques are fair, but I also think Democrats have the tendency, and the media has the tendency, to overreact and sort of overdraw conclusions. And we were talking about Zoran Mamdani a couple minutes ago. That's a great example of that. But look, the Democrats have often, I think, trapped themselves in almost an insincerity in their approach, where we've seen somebody, and I think somebody that comes to mind that's similar is Karine Jean-Pierre. I think she was an incredibly bad press secretary. I think she was wildly unpopular. I think everybody felt that way. And yet when you make a big deal of having the first Black lesbian press secretary and you kind of like have that as part of what you're selling, it's very hard then to say, well, they were bad, swap them out. And same thing, when you rely on a coalition, and I think this was smart in 2020, Kamala Harris was a smart pick and Biden won to an extent, and they had young voters turn out for her and they had Black voters turn out for her. But it's very hard then to skip over her and in a very short time, have a campaign between Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom without alienating the folks that have been there for decades and decades and people think of as the backbone of the Democratic Party. So I don't know that they had as many choices to make a bad choice as some people would say. It was a very unique situation. I will say, though, as well, I do think that Democrats constantly get caught up in this trade-off of who they want to build coalition with. Is it more towards the center or is it more towards the far left? And unfortunately, the scenarios at the time really made it so that Kamala leaned to the left, but of course not enough, because it's almost impossible, I think, to give in enough to the left for them to be happy enough to show up. And I think it's a lesson learned for Democrats again and again, whereas standing on principle, like you're talking about immigration, I actually think Biden and Harris, and by the way, Obama, had a lot of positions on immigration that the majority of the country could get behind, but they totally lost the narrative war around it because they weren't willing to just say normal things in normal words. And I think we're seeing that still. But as we kind of totally have the party imploding, there's a lot of voices that are coming through to say more things that resonate. And I will say it might actually be a benefit that there isn't some anointed or leading person at this time, because the Republican Party is lockstep with Donald Trump. There really is no room for dissent. You have people leaving office because they feel so uncomfortable disagreeing with Donald Trump. Democrats are going to have a lot of complicated conversations in front of everyone. And I think it opens it up to winning over a lot of different people.
All right, both really interesting critiques. I'm break format a little bit. Again, there's some minor news today, but nothing I feel compelled to run through completely. So I'm going to bring folks in and questions for Lyndsay and Kaivan. Kaivan, again, you can ask about whatever you want, because as you can see, these two, as Bill Clinton would say, could talk the owls down from the trees. Just as always, unmute, tell folks who don't know where you are and what's on your mind for these two, for Lyndsay and Kaivan. Alex, go ahead.
Hi guys, thanks so much. I just have a general question about the feeling of average people and their willingness to vote. I've noticed that, I was heavily involved in local elections in a blue state over the past 5 years, and there was this kind of energy behind both parties of wanting to get out there and vote, and they had views. And I've noticed that from my peers, and everyone's just kind of pulling away from politics, very frustrated by it, very uninterested in it. And what I'm finding is that people are now just finding their own tribes, and they're just pulling away from each other. They're not trying to convince the other side. They're not trying to have meaningful conversations. I myself am moving my kids to a school that just has more of my values to find people like me. And I'm wondering what that looks like for the midterms, for our society, and kind of like what this means for us as a country.
All right, well, Alex, that's like a doctoral dissertation, but great. It's great framing. It's a huge issue, but we'll let them both give it a try. But it's an unanswerable question in the sense that really is massive. But thank you for raising it, Lyndsay. Your broad thoughts, at least, on Alex's great question about division, politics, checking out, schools, etc.
Yeah, Alex, great question. It is. That is a lot to bite off, but thank you for the question. And, I think your sentiment is shared with so many people around the country right now that I've spoken with. And, I would say voting as a whole in the last decade or more has really been a challenge for a lot of people. Always the question of, does my vote matter? Does anyone care? And I would say what you're doing, getting involved in local politics, is one of the most important things to do, actually changing what you can around you. And I don't think enough people do that. And so kudos to you for getting involved in what you can, because I think that's where people see things change, is on, the micro level instead of the macro level. But, I actually wrote a paper on this in grad school. I grew up a military brat, and so I got exposed to a lot of different cultures and people groups, just living all around the world. And it was always fascinating to me just to realize our vast, the vast amount of things that we have in common with people that look very different than us and act very different than us. But at face value, you don't get that. And I think that that's a huge detriment that, even though we are so connected to the world more than we have ever been in our entire lives through technology and the internet, we're actually more insular than we've ever been as well, because we get in these echo chambers. And I think part of that is with the way these algorithms are built to force us into these in certain ways, which is detrimental to society, that we don't know how to talk to people anymore. We don't know how to have people over to our homes to have dinner and open ourselves up to different ideas. And that is uncomfortable. And people don't like change. People don't like things that make them uncomfortable. And so they become insular. But I also think, and this is a problem that I would actually mostly blame on the media and on politicians at the top, that we like to fight. And that's why I give huge props to what Mark is trying to do and is doing through two-way, is to be able to have productive, hard conversations with people that we may not agree with on many different levels, but to still have peace, love, and understanding. And that's something that our society as a whole has lost. And, I worked at Google for a long time, and I had just come from the RNC, and many people said to me, I've never talked to somebody who's on the conservative, who's represented the conservative side at all. but you seem normal. And it was really fascinating to me because these people were living in worlds where everyone was groupthink and saying the exact same things. And what they had learned through working with me for years was that I was a safe and, to their own terms, a cool person. And, I think it's more exposing, our children and ourselves to uncomfortable situations. Learning, I mean, you don't want to be in toxic things, but it's incumbent upon society to do the hard work in our own communities to change the paradigm that has been created for us. And I think that is going to be really tough. There's not an easy solution to that.
Lyndsay, that was both brilliant and lovely. Thank you for that. Kaivan, thoughts? Kaivan,
Kaivan, no worries.
Sorry.
And I was going to joke, did Mark pay you to ask that question? Because I do feel like we need a lot more platforms like this. And my background is, so I actually spent 10 years in the Ivy League at Brown, Harvard, and Yale. And I recently wrote a piece, because there are all these calls for Democrats to find their own Joe Rogan, really arguing that Democrats would immediately cancel their own Joe Rogan because he wouldn't say I statements, he wouldn't say things the right way, right? We've seen that a lot, and I do feel like it's really a culture that Democrats have exported from elite educational forums where you are learning how to have conversations in a way that's very sort of structured, to hear certain voices that you might not, and those are valuable experiences in an academic setting. But I think then those folks get out and they go to law school and they repeat that and they kind of learn a way of talking that doesn't resonate. And also, I think even worse, doesn't allow for, people to change their ideas, people to have conversations and take risks. Even asking a question can be viewed as offensive, whereas most voters are hanging out, right? It's like people talked about Kamala losing the barbershop vote. But at the barbershop, you're allowed to go one day, say something stupid, and you're invited to the conversation the next day, and nobody's sort of gonna start you at zero credibility because they didn't like what you said the day before. And I think we have to get back into that mode. Now, I will say, I wouldn't put it all on politicians and the legacy media. I would say social media has so much to do with it, because I'm an influencer too. I have a couple 100,000 followers. And on TikTok, on Twitter, the incentive is 100% to be 1,000 tweets behind your candidate, your party. Anything you say that's a minor criticism, you're gonna get hammered for. It doesn't feel great, I can tell you. But if you want to have thoughtful conversations and actually smart conversations that move forward, you have to do it. But let me targeting, there's sort of the symbiotic relationship on social media between the Republican influencers and the Democratic influencers, where it's like reality TV. They're going to go after each other, they're going to rip each other up, and people want to watch it. And then they're going to respond, and people want to watch that. Like, I was watching a doom scroll of, hours of back and forth between these influencers yesterday, because that's sort of where things have gone. So there really isn't a forum for a nuanced take. And I think that's what's been so incredibly damaging to I think particularly Democrats in some extent, because they keep losing. And so they're the ones that need to kind of have some of these real conversations at the time.
Yeah, and I will say that over the 4th of July, my family is split. I mean, half of us are conservative, half of us are liberal. And my uncle, who's like a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, he will only vote on climate change issues, is so much more open to me than millennial and Gen Z liberals. Like, he's just willing to have the conversation with me. He's willing to set aside our political differences to just love each other. And I find myself actually really resonating with the boomer libs versus, it's just a weird, it just makes me sad, I guess. Yeah. I want to.
I don't want to overgeneralize, and I hope my niece and nephew aren't watching, but younger liberals are the most intolerant people I've ever met. Not all of them, but some of them are the most intolerant people I've ever met. They have zero a willingness to accommodate different points of view, and something's gone horribly wrong in this country in terms of our education system, that young people in my lifetime experience, open-minded, understanding, maybe not as ideological, but I find it just stunning, and something that we need to figure out how to address, because we can't just keep having young intolerant people. It just doesn't work. Alex, thank you for coming. Grateful to you always for participating. Thank you so much. All right, let's just keep rolling right along here, because that was a good one. Johnny, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know the breed, make, model number of that lovely animal. and where you are and what's on your mind.
Hey guys, how you doing? This is a French bulldog. His name's Thor. His brother is over there eating figs that fell off the tree. I'm in San Diego, retiring from the Navy this year, starting law school.
Awesome.
I just had a question for it's something Dan said a couple days ago, and just something we could kick around. But Dan said the other day when Sean was bringing up the point that, just in broad strokes, generalities, that one of the reasons why liberals and leftists might want illegal immigrants in the country is their voting base.
Yeah.
And you were kind of like, show me the receipts. And Dan was like, well, we're losing the Latino vote.
Yeah.
And to me, that was kind of like, you got a high school student that's cheating on a test, but he fails the test. So then
Right.
claims that he's not cheating. And it's like, well, you might have been bad at it, but that doesn't excuse the honor violation. And I think I think it's less so. And then, usually in this conversation, I feel like a few talking points get thrown and then it kind of drops off. But, the reality here is that apportionment in California and Texas and in Washington, D.C. in those, at least in those two states, if there wasn't 11 million people in this country illegally, Democrats would probably lose between 6 and 10 seats instantly.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a fact that can be
They
disputed.
stopped the apportionment updates long ago, though.
Yeah.
Right?
No, well, it's based off the census, which has no citizenship question.
I thought the first Trump administration changed that, but maybe I'm wrong. But let me just go to the point, and then I'd love to hear what our two guests think. So if you think they're doing it for the census, or you think they're doing it for voters, maybe they are, but I see no evidence of it. I see other reasons why they're doing it. So you might be right, but
what are the other reasons?
They believe the United States is a nation of immigrants, and that people who come here help the economy and are fleeing circumstances that are either about poverty or physical danger, and that we need to be a welcoming country, and that again, they're an important part of the economy, not in an exploitative way, but in a way that they think makes sense. And they believe that, and I'm talking about opening the border the way it was in the early years of the Biden administration, but they believe that many of the people who come here are the way a lot of people came to the country early on. So I'm not excusing the open border. I'm not saying conclusively that it's not the two sinister reasons that you and others believe. What I'm saying is, to have a good rational debate about it, we shouldn't assert we know the reasons they're doing it without any evidence whatsoever. There's literally no evidence. There's no meeting. There's no meeting notes.
I truly wasn't saying I believe it. I think it gets lost in the sauce by people saying, oh, there's only 3 instances of undocumented people voting in 2024. But I think the real issue is the apportionment of congressional seats.
Maybe, but you don't know that. And again, there's tens of millions of Americans. There are tens of millions of Americans.
The seats that are gained are in California cities and in Texas cities. They're lost in red states.
But there are tens of millions of, well, Texas is a red state. There are tens of millions of Americans.
The seats are in Austin and Houston and Dallas.
Understood. There are tens of millions of Americans who think that's fine. They think it's fine because they're often paying taxes. They're contributing to society in other ways. Again, I'm not saying that's my position. I'm saying there are tens of millions of people who think that. And even if they came here and voted in large numbers for Democrats, and even if they do affect the apportionment, that doesn't mean it's the motive for Democrats favoring relatively or extremely permissive policies. It doesn't mean it's the motive. It could be a product. All I'm trying to do is avoid the calmest premise. It might be strange.
Illegal immigration is an 80-20 issue, and voter ID is an 80-20 issue. And it so am I just supposed to rely on the benevolence of liberals?
If I could respond,
yes, sir. Please come in, and then Lyndsay.
I do think we have. I just looked this up to double check, but the Reapportionment Act of 1929 permanently capped the House of Reps at 435 seats, and that's what the Electoral College plus the 100 is based off of. So this isn't like the more count is driving up these votes, but that I think
it redistricts population centers.
Yeah, but it's shifting.
I think what we should really focus on, though, is your vote in Wisconsin is 50 plus times more powerful towards the outcome of these elections than your vote as an individual in California. So you can argue it the other way as well.
But that was an actual intended consequence of the Constitution.
I mean, we were going to talk about crypto.
Not 11 million
because,
people here
right, there's
undocumented.
so many things that the framers didn't consider.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just interesting to be more upset about those things than, you know, the desecration of our Constitution right now. And so it's hard to have these conversations when there's like such a laser focus on an issue without necessarily the facts, which I'm open to different facts, but I haven't seen them. And then not focusing on the facts that we do have before us, like the Daily News and Trump sort of tearing away a lot of the fabric that those who claim to care what the founders thought would be appalled by. So,
hold on there. Hold on, Lyndsay. I'd love you to respond to what Johnny raised, and then we're going to switch topics.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Johnny. Thanks for your service too. So I would say, you know, immigration is an issue that no one has been able to solve. And I think that's a detriment to both sides of this conversation because, you know, Biden had hopes of fixing the immigration issue. He wasn't able to do it. And many voters who I spoke with on the campaign trail, you know, thought that he would broaden the path to citizenship, that he would bring in more judges to process asylum cases and naturalizing citizen cases. He didn't do it. You know, I can't say, you know, I agree with Mark. There isn't emphatic evidence to prove that this is the sole reason they're doing it. I do know, I can't remember the exact quote, I was trying to look it up, that Chuck Schumer did make comments that were questionable about trying to make the 11 million undocumented immigrants voters and having them in the voting block. And, you know, the Hispanic community is the second largest voting block in the country. So it is a very important voting block, but you know, Democrats lost a lot of those, specifically Hispanic men. And again, I talked to so many people who were here legally during the campaign. I focused on this issue on the campaign trail, speaking to people, you know, who were focused on Hispanic voters. And people who are here illegally are so frustrated because they feel like they've gotten a bad rap. And our legal system is very difficult to navigate. And they felt like, you know, no one was fighting for them enough. And many of them thought, well, I don't want to be a part of this open border process. And so for that reason, I'm going to vote for Trump. At least he's going to shut that down. And I would say on that front, how he has handled immigration. I mean, some of his recent polling is over 50% still on the immigration issue, despite some of like how he's handled recent ICE incidents and so forth. But what I would say is, I think both and can be true. Just nobody is addressing the issue correctly in allowing our process to become a naturalized citizen or to be here legally, even if you're a farm worker, is not fair. And that does need to be addressed. And I haven't seen either side doing a good job of that. As far as the intent, I can't be certain either, because I don't think there's enough evidence to prove one way or the other.
Yeah, Johnny, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, let's switch topics. Lyndsay and Kaivan, I'm going to ask you a question. No pressure. When we think about cryptocurrency, I want you to say which of these labels applies to you. Expert, knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, as ignorant as my 8-year-old son. Lyndsay.
Your 8-year-old son.
Seriously, you're that
No, but you didn't give me like a go-between.
Yeah. All right, so you'd say limited knowledge, maybe.
Limited knowledge. I know enough because it's become such an initiative of this administration.
Yeah.
But the whole process as a whole is confusing to me about, you know, I understand the concept of what it is and the goal to make it essentially the new gold, but like how it works, why it's so successful.
Yeah. Okay.
I do not understand all that.
Okay. Kaivan, how would you compare yourself?
I would say somewhat familiar. I have the Coinbase app. I have yet to purchase any Bitcoin.
Why haven't you done it yet?
You know, I almost was going to do it. I actually, a much older advisor who's really into all these things. And she was like, if I was your age, I would buy $5,000 of at least both coins. What is it? Ethereum and the other one. And I was about to do it. I asked a financial expert that I trust who's more close to my age, and he was like, I don't believe in it. And I thought it was somewhat compelling. So I've held off for now, but maybe I missed the opportunity to be rich.
All right. Joining us now is Paul Grewal. He's the counsel at Coinbase, one of the industry leaders, and a man who spends his life dealing with smart and less than smart people who have the exact attitude that you two do. And he does his public educating with good cheer and patience, which we appreciate. And great to have you back, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to see you again.
So on this platform, one of the main thing we try to do is try to build authentic community around shared interests, and for this show, politics and news. We also try to be both sophisticated and accessible, right? So everybody who's on here now watching has a range of knowledge about this industry and about why there's so much energy around it. We've gone from an administration that everybody in the industry, the Biden administration, said was at best uninterested, at worst hostile, to an industry and a president who are extremely enthusiastic. And now in Congress, I think, to me, and Paul, I want to ask you about this, for the industry, a heartening amount of bipartisan consensus about the importance of smart regulation that doesn't impede America's leadership in this industry, but helps accelerate it. So it's very important for you all. If you're super sophisticated about the industry, you're going to be interested in what Paul has to say. And if you're closer to where Lyndsay is and have a basic understanding, you're going to get a lot out of this. So here we go, Paul. And again, great to have you back here. July 20th is Shark Week. But before that, July 14th in the House of Representatives is Crypto Week. And they're all excited about it. I'd say they're as excited about it as I am about Shark Week. So explain to everybody, what is the House doing? What is Crypto Week in the House of Representatives next week?
Well, first of all, Mark, happy Crypto Week, early Crypto Week to you and to everybody else on. I, for one, could not be more excited to help celebrate that next week. Look, what's going on in the House and across the Congress is that legislation to regulate the crypto industry is finally taking shape. We've seen bills on a particular kind of digital asset or cryptocurrency, something called a stable coin, make great progress in the Senate, and we expect to see the House next week vote in favor of that same legislation. The House is also going to take up a broader bill to regulate the cryptocurrency industry, something that we refer to as the market structure bill, which will define, the basic parameters for what tokens or cryptocurrencies are subject to the jurisdiction of the Securities and Exchange Commission, what other tokens fall outside of that jurisdiction, and how can we regulate this industry so that we promote the innovation for sure, but at the same time protect investors and keep people safe when they decide to allocate a small portion or even a not so small portion of their portfolio to this important new class.
Let's do 101, because again, both accessible and sophisticated. What are, you use phrases like cryptocurrency and coins, stable coin. 101, what are those?
Well, the original cryptocurrency is something called Bitcoin. And this was introduced to the world nearly a decade and a half ago in a white paper by an anonymous character or set of characters named Satoshi Nakamoto. And the basic idea of Bitcoin, I think, was to create a way for people to exchange value on the internet without having to rely upon an intermediary like a bank or some other kind of formal financial institution. You can think of it, Mark, as a peer-to-peer payment system, much like, for those of you who remember, peer-to-peer music exchanges back in the early 2000s, allowing people to swap music online through a service called Napster. Napster ultimately went away and regulated forms of that peer-to-peer system came into place. We're now seeing regulated cryptocurrencies take shape in a similar manner. Stable coins are another type of digital asset that are very different from Bitcoin in one very important respect. Whereas Bitcoin is a digital gold, Mark, that rises and falls in values with the whims of the market, and sometimes that can be quite volatile. A stable coin is a digital asset that is backed by a currency issued by a government, like, say, the US dollar, and can be redeemed for a US dollar whenever anybody wants it. So it's very stable in value, hence the name. And it can be very useful for people wanting to make payments across the internet or to send money home if they're working in one country and supporting family in another, right, without having to pay a lot of the fees.
So how is stablecoin different than Apple Pay or Zelle or PayPal?
Yeah, so Apple Pay or Zelle or PayPal all rely upon a central intermediary or the company to manage the exchange of those payments. There's a ledger, much like the old books that used to be kept in the banking institutions of the 19th century. It happens to be now in electronic form, but it sits behind a wall that one particular company, Apple, PayPal, or somebody else, manages. With peer-to-peer payments on the internet supported by stable coins, there is no central intermediary. There's an open ledger, that anyone can consult, anyone can check, that is secured by thousands and thousands of people validating those transactions in real time. So it just is a more distributed,
Why is that? Why is that better?
It's better because you're not dependent upon one company to get it right. If you happen, for example, to have a political view or a profile that may be out of favor with that one company, in the case of traditional payments, you're out of luck. That institution, whether it's Apple, PayPal, or your bank, can simply refuse you service, and you're out of luck. With a stable coin or with many other types of digital assets, you are not bound to or tied to any one institution. And so you have free access to them to your accounts. And critically, because of that, the cost of providing that service is much lower. So it's much cheaper to operate.
Right. Okay, two more from me. Then I'm going to let Lyndsay and Kaivan ask the questions, and we're going to open up the community. So again, if you want to ask questions about this complex but important topic for Paul, please raise your hand. We talked about Crypto Week in the House next week. Senator Scott, chairman of banking, had a hearing today. And again, there's rare in a complex industry like social media platforms or anything complex, and yours is a complex industry. It's rare to have the two things we seem to have now, which is bipartisan consensus for action and a belief that it's important to act, that the time is now to move rather than have it be derailed. So what are the principles that Democrats and Republicans in Congress agree to around your industry?
There is a consensus for sure, and it is a bipartisan one, which is highly unusual in Washington. Look, I think what the political leadership of our country agrees on in large measure is that tens of millions of Americans now own these cryptocurrencies or digital assets. Something like 52 million Americans, in fact, own some type of crypto or another. And so I think they recognize that this is part of our financial landscape, whether you like crypto, whether you hate crypto, or whether you have no opinion about it whatsoever. And so what I think there is emerging consensus on is that we need to have rules in place to govern these assets. There need to be basic standards in place so that you're not just depending upon the goodwill and good nature of companies like mine to do the right thing. There's law in place, and that people can be held accountable if they break rules or if they fail to follow the rules that Congress has enacted. I think it's the political heft of those 52 million Americans combined with a recognition that we need to update our financial system. Too many Americans are excluded from the current traditional system, and they want to see alternatives that are offered by things like stable coins, Bitcoins, and the like.
All right, I'm going to defer on my other question. Lyndsay, question for Paul.
Paul, I'm so happy you're here. I really am the novice here at this. So I do have one, and this might be too in the weeds, but this is my knowledge base. I have Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, which I believe was one of the first to be traded on the NASDAQ. Is that right? To be traded publicly?
Yeah, Grayscale was an early pioneer in making available to the masses, to a wide swath of Americans, access to Bitcoin through the ETF product or trust that they initially had set up.
Yeah. So is that the future where you will have actually these that are able to be publicly traded opposed to having to go on Coinbase or another app that's specifically only for crypto? Or is crypto kind of staying away from that to still kind of have their own world? Because I think that that is a detractor for someone like me who does, buy and sell stocks, that it feels unstable. It feels uncertain, unknown. I obviously don't know anything really about it, but this feels safer. I read about Grayscale. Okay, I can dabble in that where it at least feels more promising and more hopeful.
Yeah, I think, look, it's important to understand that the original vision for Bitcoin in particular was people literally holding these tokens themselves on hardware wallets with long seed phrases as passwords and very complicated technology. What we have seen over time, though, is that people want to have alternatives that are less complicated and frankly a little less scary. In the first instance, that meant coming to a company like Coinbase and setting up an account, much like you'd set up an account on Schwab or Fidelity or Robinhood, and being able to manage your Bitcoin that way. Firms like Grayscale and other ETF providers now provide an even simpler way, if you prefer that, for accessing this type of digital asset through products that look a lot like other types of ETFs that you might have in your 401k. So I think that in the future, and the future is basically now, You're going to have lots of different ways to access these products. And which product you choose will be a function of what you're comfortable with and where you have the most confidence.
Kaivan, you said you opened a Coinbase account, but you haven't done anything with it yet, right?
Yes.
Why'd you open the account?
Well, I thought that I didn't want to miss my chance to make a ton of money and be one of those in 50 years. It's like, oh, if only I bought some crypto. I guess my hesitation, and with the spirit of this being an open conversation, please don't take it the wrong way. I feel like the Venn diagram of people that talk to me about crypto is like a perfect circle with like conspiracy theory, alien, and also maybe a little like the figures that seem to be leading it seem incredibly sketchy. And you talk about, I think this would be a helpful example, people that are sort of cut out by mainstream banks for what they believe and say. And I wonder if you'd have like 2 or 3 examples of where that's happened and and make the argument, I guess, that it was a bad thing.
Right. So brilliant. And Paul is the general counsel, not head of sales and marketing, but nonetheless, he's going to have you by 8 o'clock Eastern time. He's going to have your account loaded
I guess
up.
just the quick example I
go
give is like pornography and underage, things that happen there, and obviously MasterCard and other banks and things have also come in on that issue.
Paul has heard all of this, and now he's going to respond, and he's going to try to act sketchy as he does it.
And I'm going to buy crypto right after this. So no.
Well, look, I think that the reality is that, look, I'm a 53-year-old father of 2. I used to serve as a federal judge. I hope I'm not the sketchy, scary character that you may have in your mind who's peddling cryptocurrencies and digital assets, perhaps in the way that some people imagine. This is now a mature industry, frankly, a bit of a boring industry relative to some of our early days. And while it's true that in the early days, there were some colorful characters and our fair share of illicit activity, I think the industry has grown up in quite a significant way in just the past several years. And while we continue to have challenges from time to time, much as the MasterCards and Visas and banks of the world encounter, this is an industry that has arrived and recognizes that if we want to have not just 52 million Americans, but 500 million people or 5 billion people all over the world using this asset class, we need to provide people with confidence. And that confidence is going to come from being very open, being very transparent, securing these assets in ways that people like you and everybody else can have confidence in. And also operating in plain sight and in addressing the concerns that people do continue to have about whether this is a safe or appropriate investment for them or for their families. Now, I think as far as, the reason why people have, I think, hesitated thus far in fully embracing technology, in large part has to do with the concerns that we've just discussed. But I think if you look at the rate of criminality, if you look at the rate of illicit activity when it comes to cryptocurrencies, the best third-party research actually confirms that it's no more, no less, no different than with traditional banking. Now, as far as including more people in this economy, the reason why cryptocurrency offers real alternatives and real choices is that, again, with the banks, as we've seen, and with traditional assets, there is an ability to exclude people from accounts if that is their preference. I'm not just engaging in a little conspiracy theory here. I'm actually just relying upon facts that we discussed in several hearings in front of Congress. In fact, that took place just earlier this year. And when I testified before Congress on the subject, we talked about examples of firms in the cryptocurrency industry that were denied basic banking services by regulated banks. We have many examples, I think, of people with controversial political views who have been excluded from basic banking services. And, whatever you may think about their underlying opinions or the businesses that they're engaged in, I would hope that we as Americans can agree that access to basic financial services should not be a matter of politics or preference. Illegality needs to be addressed, but simply having a controversial political view or engaging in a disfavored industry shouldn't be a reason to exclude someone from having a basic checking account.
Or a new industry. Brian, welcome in. Thanks for joining. Question after you tell folks where you are.
Of course. I'm in Huntsville, Alabama, the rightful home of the Space Force. I don't know if I can keep saying that, but I'm going to keep pushing.
Yes, sir. It's a good reminder every time.
Thanks for having me. I'm just curious, Paul, and for others, I think it really rings a bell for me where we talk about the tech related to Bitcoin, stablecoin, and some of the other technology that comes with it. And then the spec or the speculation. It seems that Congress is mostly concerned right now with this sort of speculative, exploitative nature of the market. Do you think there's any congressional involvement or oversight on the tech side? Of what you've been talking about so far. For me, I see the same thing in AI. I don't want to draw too strong of the parallel, but I think that's the classic problem: is where does Congress dig in, and where can they dig in?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think the analogy to AI is appropriate because, with any new technology, people have questions and that's quite reasonable and quite understandable. And I do think it is Congress's responsibility to engage with those questions and make sure that information about, why we should have confidence in this new technology, how people are going to be kept safe, be shared. I think, one of the things we've seen with Congress, I think over the last several years is that unfortunately, there's been as much interest in having the fight, whether it's dealing with the social networks, whether it's regulating things like artificial intelligence, as much as actually getting to solutions to the problems that we see. Now, the legislation that I mentioned will provide for strong oversight and strong consumer protections for people who choose to engage with this asset class, and it should. It's also important to bear in mind that there's nothing particularly new about fraud or other illicit activity when it comes to cryptocurrencies. If someone's committing fraud, they're violating the law as it stands today, and they should be held accountable. So I do think the existing laws offer some protections. I think the new laws are going to offer much more, but Congress is going to have to stay engaged with the issue if people are going to continue to have confidence that we're on top of this.
Brian, thank you. Andrew, welcome, and tell folks who don't know what planet you're on or where you are and what's on your mind.
I'm on Mars. I'm actually in Waltham, Mass. It's about 5 miles away from Boston.
Yes, sir.
And my question about Bitcoins and cryptocurrency is that, how is it different from fiat currency? Because Trump was able to just create his coins out of thin air, and it just seems like this is going to be so inflationary if people convert that to real currency.
Great question, Andrew. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah. So, the main difference is that a fiat currency, whether a dollar or euro or any other kind of government issued currency, is ultimately backed by nothing more, nothing less, but nothing more than the full faith and credit of that government. Right. And so, for any of us who happen to hold a dollar bill in our hands, the thing that gives us confidence that that dollar is worth something is the government telling us that it's worth something. Cryptocurrencies rely upon a different mechanism to provide that same confidence. And that mechanism is a consensus by thousands or even millions of different people participating in these networks that asset is what it purports to be, that when you acquire a bit of Bitcoin at a certain price and wish to redeem it at that same price or at another price, you'll be able to do that. And, while it can feel a little unusual and even a little unnerving to trust something other than the government to say that it's worth what it purports to be, we do this all the time in all sorts of other markets, right? If you think about gold, if you think about Pokemon cards, if you think about any number of assets like wheat or corn or whatever, we don't rely upon the full faith and credit of the government for its value. We trust that there's a market that will set a price, and if we wish to buy it in that market or sell in that market, we'll get that price. That's the way that cryptocurrencies generally work, and I think it's very consistent with the way lots of markets work and all sorts of other products and services.
Can I jump in real quick here, Mark?
Yes, ma'am.
And follow
Please
up
do.
on that, Paul?
Sure.
So I know that there is a desire, as I just briefly mentioned, from the administration, this essentially would be like the future gold for the world and almost a universal, dollar, that it would be a universal currency. What would it take to make that happen? And are there things actively happening that you feel like would turn that into reality in the near term?
Well, that I think is certainly a goal for some. They want to see a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin emerge as a universal standard, not bound to any one government or one group of people. I think for that to happen, Lyndsay, ultimately it will take millions and millions of people, perhaps billions of people all over the world deciding that's what they want. And I think one of the things that attracts a lot of people to cryptocurrencies and digital assets is that it gives regular people, not just people in power or influence, but regular people, a sense that they have a stake in the outcome that may not be true as true for them in when it comes to traditional financial services or product. Very few of us, for example, feel like we have a real say with the Federal Reserve, even though, through the political process, there's some type of oversight. With Bitcoin and with other digital assets, there is a much more direct form of democracy taking place. And I think that's what's appealing to folks. Whether that vision becomes reality, I think we're just going to have to see over time. But that is, I think, an element of what is so attractive to so many people about this new technology.
Paul, what international governing bodies exist to deal with your industry?
Yeah, so each country in which companies like mine operate have financial regulators equivalent to the SEC or the Department of Treasury. That's true in Europe, that's true in Asia, that's true all over the world. And then there are global bodies such as the Bank for International Settlements and others that coordinate activity regarding cryptocurrencies, much in the same way as they coordinate activity among central banks and the like. So there is an emerging global consensus here. But, Mark, one of the reasons why I think Congress feels so compelled to act now with rules for crypto here in the United States is that other countries have not been afraid to race ahead of the United States, even as we've been kind of struggling to get our act together over the last 4 years. And so I think there's a real sense in the Congress right now that unless the U.S. acts, we are at risk of seeing yet another technology go overseas and at risk of finding ourselves in 30 or 50 years wondering who lost this industry, much in the same way as we're debating now who lost many industries that we once dominated a generation ago.
What are the Chinese doing in this sector?
Well, the Chinese have been very active in cryptocurrency and digital assets. And I think that's one of the reasons why Congress feels it's important for American leadership to continue in this area. The fact of the matter is that while China has had its fits and starts with crypto, embracing it for a time, banning it for a while, but now embracing it once again, there's no question that China is very interested in a digital yuan or a digitized version of their national currency to facilitate these types of movements of value. And many see a currency like Bitcoin as a way to thwart or blunt that effort before it really takes root.
Paul, for people in this community who would like to do a longer 101 than you did this hour, are there things you recommend folks read to start from scratch?
Absolutely. I'd start with the Bitcoin white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto. As I mentioned, it was first published on the internet not long after the great financial crisis of 2008. It's written in plain English. It's very accessible to a lay audience, and it really kind of explains the original vision.
What would you Google to find that?
You'd Google Bitcoin white paper and Satoshi, and I guarantee it'll be the first link that you find. And beyond that, if you Google Coinbase Institute, that's an internal think tank we've set up. We have a number of white papers there that explain some of the mechanics of how a stable coin operates, what's the difference between a brokerage and exchange, and all the different elements of this new system that are taking shape that I think will shed a lot of light for people who are interested in this stuff.
Kaivan, you ready to invest?
I'll do my research.
Okay.
As you should, as you always should.
Paul, love having you on and look forward to having you back. And Lyndsay, great to always have you on. And Kaivan, great to have you for the first time and hope you'll come back as well.
Would love to.
Thank you for having us, Mark.
Thank you all.
Great.
Really grateful to you. All right. In just a few moments, coming up here on Two Way, my friend Bridget Fedesi is her program called Real America will be here. And I urge you to watch it. Tonight's episode is about addiction. And it's a topic familiar to many Americans, including to Bridget. She met her husband in the context of dealing with addiction, and he'll be joining as well. Great topic, great story. And if you've not sampled Bridget's show, tonight should be the night. She's one of the most extraordinarily talented people and colleagues I've ever had. And I urge you to watch it. I'll be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern time with Sean and Dan on the morning meeting. And this program will be on in 23 hours again. Thank you for watching. Thanks to our three guests, and have a great evening.